The year was 1847, and the Oregon Trail stretched endlessly before thousands of hopeful settlers seeking new lives in the promised land of the West. Among them was Sarah Mitchell, a 23-year-old woman carrying her first child, walking beside a weathered wagon that held everything she owned in the world. What she didn't know was that in just 3 days her own people would abandon her to die alone in the wilderness, and her salvation would come from the very people she had been taught to fear most. This is the true story of survival, unexpected kindness, and the bonds that form between strangers when humanity trumps prejudice. It's a tale that challenges everything we think we know about the American frontier, where the line between civilized and savage wasn't always where we expected it to be. Sarah Mitchell felt the wooden wheel of their wagon jolt over another rock as she walked alongside it. One hand pressed against her growing belly. The baby inside her kicked restlessly, as if sensing the tension that had been building in their wagon train for the past 2 weeks. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Nebraska plains, and dust clouds kicked up by 60 wagons made breathing difficult. She pulled her bonnet lower over her face and tried to ignore the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she came near. Her husband Thomas walked ahead with the oxen, his shoulders rigid with the stress of keeping their animals healthy and their wagon moving. They had joined Captain Morrison's wagon train in Independence, Missouri, back in April, with high hopes and careful savings. Thomas had sold his blacksmith shop, and they had invested everything in this journey to Oregon Territory, where land was free and opportunities were endless. Now, 3 months into their journey, Sarah wondered if they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The problems had started when Mrs. Henderson, the wagon master's wife, had declared that Sarah's pregnancy was slowing down the entire train. It wasn't true, of course. Sarah had kept up with the grueling pace of 15 miles a day, walking most of the way to spare their oxen. She helped with cooking duties every evening and took her turn gathering buffalo chips for fuel. But Mrs. Henderson had influence, and slowly, other families began to echo her complaints. "We can't afford delays," Thomas had overheard Mr. Peterson saying just that morning. "Winter comes early in the mountains and every day counts. That woman should have stayed home until after the baby came." Sarah tried not to let the words sting, but they did. She was 5 months along, and the baby wouldn't arrive until late October or early November. They would be well settled in Oregon Territory by then, assuming they maintained their current pace. The real problem wasn't her pregnancy at all. It was fear. 2 nights ago, they had seen smoke signals rising from hills to the north. The guide, a gruff mountain man named Jake Sullivan, had assured everyone they were probably just pawnee hunting parties, nothing to worry about. But the sight of those thin columns of smoke had set everyone on edge. Suddenly, every shadow looked like a warrior, every distant dust cloud like a war party approaching. People needed someone to blame for their fear, and Sarah, heavy with child and vulnerable, made an easy target. She had noticed the way conversation stopped when she approached the evening cooking fires, the way other women pulled their children closer when she walked by, the way men avoided meeting Thomas's eyes when he tried to join their discussions about the trail ahead. The irony wasn't lost on her. Back in Ohio, she and Thomas had been respected members of their community. Thomas's ironwork was sought after for miles around, and Sarah taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church. Now, surrounded by people who had been their neighbors and friends just months ago, they were becoming outcasts. That evening, as the wagons formed their usual defensive circle for the night, Captain Morrison called a meeting. Sarah's heart sank as she saw the grim faces gathered around the central fire. Thomas squeezed her hand as they approached the group, but she could feel his palm sweating despite the cool evening air. Captain Morrison was a fair man, Sarah had always thought, but tonight his weathered face looked troubled. He cleared his throat and looked directly at her before speaking. "Folks, we need to talk about our situation. We're still 3 weeks out from Fort Laramie, and we've been making good time. But I've been getting concerns from some families about potential delays ahead. Mrs. Pease." Henderson stepped forward, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "Captain, we all know what you're talking about. Mrs. Mitchell is due to have her baby any day now from the looks of her. What happens when she goes into labor out here in the middle of nowhere? Do we just stop the whole train and wait? Winter won't wait for us." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Ma'am, I'm not due until October. We'll be well into Oregon Territory by then." "That's what you say now, Mr." Peterson interjected. "But babies come when they want to come. My Martha had our youngest 2 months early. What if that happens to you out here?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Sarah has been keeping up with everyone else. She pulls her weight around camp every night. What exactly are you asking us to do?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked around the circle at faces that had once been friendly, seeing only suspicion and fear now. These were good people, she tried to tell herself. Family people who had sacrificed everything for the dream of a better life in Oregon. Fear was making them cruel, not inherent meanness. Finally, Captain Morrison spoke again. Nobody's asking you to do anything drastic, Thomas, but we need to think about the good of the whole train. Maybe you folks should consider staying at Fort Laramie when we get there. Have the baby in safety, then catch up with another train next spring. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Stay at Fort Laramie for the winter? They didn't have money for that kind of delay. They had calculated their savings down to the last dollar, with just enough to establish themselves in Oregon territory. A winter at the fort would bankrupt them, assuming they could even find work there. Captain, Thomas said carefully, we've put everything we own into this journey. We can't afford to winter over at the fort. Then maybe you should have thought of that before you got your wife pregnant, Mrs. Bean. Henderson snapped, then immediately looked embarrassed by her own harshness. The meeting broke up without any official decisions being made. But Sarah could feel the mood of the camp shifting around them like quicksand. As they walked back to their wagon, she noticed that the Hendersons had moved their wagon further away from theirs. The Petersons too. By morning, Sarah realized, they would likely find themselves isolated at the edge of the camp circle. That night, as Sarah lay in their wagon listening to Thomas toss restlessly beside her, she placed both hands on her belly and whispered a prayer. The baby kicked strongly, as if responding to her touch. Whatever happened, she would protect this child. She had to believe that somehow everything would work out. But deep in her heart, she was beginning to fear that the real dangers of the Oregon Trail weren't wild animals or hostile Indians. They were the people she had trusted to help her family reach their new life safely. And those people were already starting to see her not as a fellow traveler in need of support, but as a burden they could no longer afford to carry. The next morning brought new challenges that would test everyone's resolve. Sarah woke to the sound of men shouting and cattle lowing in distress. She climbed carefully out of the wagon to see what was happening, and found chaos. During the night, something had spooked the livestock. 3 cows and 2 oxen had wandered off, following what looked like wolf tracks leading north toward a line of low hills. Jake Sullivan, their guide, was already saddling his horse. I'll track them down, he called to Captain Morrison. But it's going to cost us most of the morning, maybe longer. Sarah watched as the wagon master's face darkened. She could practically read his thoughts. Another delay, more lost time. And all eyes in the camp seemed to turn toward her, as if somehow her pregnancy had caused the cattle to stray. Henderson didn't even bother to lower her voice this time. Every delay puts us closer to winter in the mountains. We can't afford this. Thomas was already hitching their oxen, his movements sharp and angry. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking at the other men. He had always been proud of his strength, his ability to provide for his family. Being treated like a liability was eating away at him. Thomas, she said quietly, moving to help him with the harness, maybe we should talk to Captain Morrison privately. Work out some kind of arrangement. He looked at her with eyes full of pain and frustration. What kind of arrangement, Sarah? They want us gone. They're just looking for an excuse to leave us behind. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah knew he was right, but she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. These were supposed to be good Christian people. Surely they wouldn't abandon a pregnant woman in the middle of the wilderness. By noon, Sullivan had returned with the missing livestock, but the damage was done. They had lost half a day, and the mood in the camp was darker than ever. Sarah noticed that when the wagons formed up to move out, theirs was definitely positioned at the very back of the train now, behind even the spare oxen and the camp followers. As they walked through the afternoon heat, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. The other women no longer invited her to walk with them. The children, picking up on their parents' moods, stayed away from her. Even the family dog, a friendly mutt named Rufus, who had always begged for scraps from her, seemed to sense the change and kept his distance. The only person who still treated her with any kindness was Dr. Marcus Whitman, a missionary traveling with his wife Narcissa to establish a mission in Oregon Territory. He had examined Sarah early in the journey and pronounced both her and the baby healthy. That afternoon, he made a point of walking beside her wagon for a while. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Mitchell?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine concern. "Tired, doctor, but well enough. The baby is active. Good. That's a healthy sign." He was quiet for a moment, then lowered his voice. "I want you to know that if you need medical assistance, you can count on me, regardless of what others might say." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at this small kindness. "Thank you, doctor. That means more than you know." These are good people, Mrs. Mitchell. They're just frightened. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider. That evening, as if to prove the doctor's words, the situation reached its breaking point. During the evening meal, little Jimmy Peterson came running into camp, crying that he had seen Indians watching them from a ridge to the east. Captain Morrison immediately called for the wagons to be pulled into a tighter defensive circle, and guards were posted for the night. Sarah was helping to secure their wagon when she heard Mrs. Austin, Henderson's voice rising above the general commotion. "This is exactly what I've been talking about. We're sitting ducks out here, and we can't afford to be slowed down by anyone who can't pull their full weight." This time, she was looking directly at Sarah when she said it. Thomas had heard enough. He strode over to where Mrs. Henderson was standing, his face flushed with anger. "Ma'am, my wife has been pulling her weight and more. She's walked every mile the rest of you have walked, and she's done her share of camp work every night. I won't have you talking about her like she's some kind of burden." "Mr. Mitchell," Captain Morrison intervened, "nobody's saying your wife hasn't been doing her part. But we have to think about what happens if she goes into labor out here, especially with Indian sign around." "There's no Indian sign," Dr. Whitman said firmly, joining the conversation. "A child saw shadows on a ridge. It could have been elk, or horses, or his own imagination. But the damage was already done. The seed of fear had been planted and was growing rapidly in the fertile soil of everyone's existing anxieties. Sarah could see it in their faces, the way they looked at her now. She wasn't just a pregnant woman anymore. She was a liability, a weakness that could get them all killed. That night, as she lay awake listening for sounds of danger that never came, Sarah began to understand that their real journey was just beginning. The physical challenge of reaching Oregon territory was nothing compared to the human challenge of surviving the fear and prejudice of their own people. Tomorrow would bring new tests of their resolve, and Sarah had a growing feeling that she and Thomas would have to face them alone. The morning sun was barely cresting the horizon when Sarah heard the hushed voices outside their wagon. She had been awake for hours, listening to the baby's restless movements and Thomas's troubled breathing beside her. Something was wrong. The usual sounds of camp breaking up were different today, more subdued, more secretive. She carefully climbed down from the wagon, her hand instinctively supporting her belly as she moved. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. The other families were packing with unusual haste, their movements quick and furtive. No one was making eye contact with her or Thomas, who was already up and checking their oxen. Captain Morrison approached them with obvious reluctance, his weathered hands fidgeting with his hat brim. Behind him stood Mrs. Henderson and several other prominent members of the wagon train, their faces set in grim determination. "Thomas, Sarah," the captain began, his voice carefully neutral. "We need to have a word with you folks." Sarah felt her heart sink even before he continued. She could read the decision in their faces, in the way they stood in a tight group, facing her and Thomas like judges pronouncing a sentence. "The council met last night after you folks turned in," Morrison continued. "We've been talking about the situation, and we've come to a difficult decision." Thomas stepped closer to Sarah, his hand finding hers. "What kind of decision, Captain?" "The train needs to make better time. We've had too many delays already, and winter comes early in the mountains. We can't afford to risk getting caught in snow because—" he gestured awkwardly towards Sarah's condition, "because someone might need extended rest time."
"I haven't needed any rest time," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest.
"I've kept up with everyone else every single day." Mrs. Josh Wall Henderson stepped forward, her thin face pinched with what might have been guilt, but looked more like determination. "Mitchell, you're due to have that baby any day now. What happens when your labor starts? Do we just stop the whole train in the middle of nowhere and wait? Some of us have children too, and we need to think about their safety." "I'm not due for months yet," Sarah protested, but even as she said it, she could see they had already made up their minds. "Dr. Karen." Whitman pushed through the group, his face flushed with anger. "This is unconscionable. Mrs. Mitchell is perfectly healthy and capable of travel. You're making a decision based on fear, not medical reality." "Doctor, we appreciate your opinion," Captain Morrison said, "but the council has voted—" "The Mitchells will stay here while we continue on. They can catch up with the next train that comes through." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Stay here? In the middle of the Nebraska wilderness, with nothing around them but grass and sky for miles in every direction. She looked around at the faces of people she had considered friends, people she had shared meals with and prayed with for months. "You can't be serious," Thomas said, his voice rising. "You're talking about leaving my pregnant wife in the middle of nowhere. What kind of Christians are you? The kind that have responsibilities to our own families first, Mr. Peterson replied sharply. We all knew this journey would be hard. We all knew there would be difficult choices to make. Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. How long before another train comes through? The silence that followed was answer enough. Captain Morrison finally cleared his throat. Could be days. Could be weeks. But you've got supplies. And your husband's a capable man. You'll manage until help comes. And if no help comes? Thomas demanded. There's always traffic on this trail, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Whitman's wife Narcissa had been standing quietly behind the group, but now she stepped forward. Marcus and I will stay with them, she announced firmly. No, her husband said immediately. Narcissa, we have our own mission to establish. We can't delay our work. Sarah watched this small drama play out with a growing sense of unreality. These people were actually planning to abandon her and Thomas in the wilderness. After months of traveling together, of sharing dangers and hardships, they were going to drive away and leave her to give birth alone under the stars. Please, she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. I'm begging you. Don't leave us here. For a moment, she thought she saw some of them waver. Mrs. Patterson, who had a daughter about Sarah's age, looked away with tears in her eyes. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed to struggle with her conscience. But fear won out over compassion. Captain Morrison put his hat back on with an air of finality. I'm sorry, folks, I truly am, but the decision is made. We'll leave you some extra supplies and ammunition. You'll be fine until another train comes through. The next hour passed in a blur of activity that felt like a nightmare. The other families finished packing their wagons with guilty efficiency, avoiding eye contact with Sarah and Thomas. A few extra bags of flour and beans were left beside their wagon, along with some additional ammunition for Thomas's rifle. Small gifts that felt more like payments to ease guilty consciences than genuine attempts to help. Whitman made one last attempt to change the council's mind, arguing passionately about Christian duty and basic human decency. But the decision had been made, and fear had already calcified into cold resolve. As the wagons began to move out, forming their familiar line heading west, Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She stood beside her lonely wagon and watched 60 families roll away from her, leaving wheel ruts in the dirt that would be the only sign they had ever existed in this vast emptiness. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, both of them too stunned to speak. The sound of creaking wheels and lowing oxen faded gradually into the distance, leaving behind a silence that seemed to swallow the entire world. Only Dr. Whitman looked back as the train disappeared over a low rise. He raised his hand in what might have been a blessing or a farewell, and then he too was gone, leaving them alone with their wagon, their oxen, and the endless prairie stretching in all directions. What do we do now? Sarah whispered. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at the wagon ruts leading west. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. We survive. We wait for another train, and we survive. But even as he said it, they both knew the terrible mathematics of their situation. They were at least 2 weeks from Fort Laramie, the nearest settlement of any size. Their supplies, even with the extra provisions left by the departing families, might last a month if carefully rationed. And Sarah's baby was due in less than 4 months. The first day alone was the hardest. Every instinct told them to follow the wagon ruts west, to try to catch up with the train that had abandoned them. But Thomas knew their oxen couldn't maintain the pace necessary to catch up with 60 wagons, especially not with Sarah's condition to consider. Instead, they made a careful camp beside a small stream, about a mile from where they had been left. Thomas unhitched the oxen and let them graze, while Sarah took inventory of their supplies. They had enough food for perhaps 3 weeks. 4 if they were very careful. Thomas's tools and blacksmithing equipment were still in the wagon, along with their personal belongings and the few precious items they had brought from their old life in Ohio. That first night, alone under a canopy of stars that seemed both beautiful and indifferent to their plight, Sarah and Thomas held each other and tried to make plans. They would stay here by the water source and watch for other wagon trains. When one came, they would join it and continue to Oregon Territory. It was a simple plan, but it felt fragile in the face of the vast wilderness surrounding them. What if no other trains come through? Sarah asked in the darkness. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he had fallen asleep. Then he said, "They will. This is the main trail to Oregon. People are making this journey every week during traveling season." But privately, Thomas was doing his own terrible mathematics. It was already late June. Most wagon trains started their journeys in April or May to avoid the early snows in the mountains. How many more trains would come through before winter set in? And would any of them be willing to take on a heavily pregnant woman? The second day brought their first real test. Sarah woke with sharp pains in her back and a feeling of tightness across her belly that made her gasp. For several terrifying hours, both she and Thomas feared that labor was beginning. Sarah lay in the wagon, trying to breathe through the pain while Thomas paced anxiously outside. But by afternoon, the pains had eased and Dr. Whitman's medical advice came back to her. False labor was common, especially during times of stress. The baby wasn't coming yet. But the scare reminded them both of how precarious their situation really was. On the third day, they saw their first hope. A dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon, moving slowly toward them. Thomas climbed onto their wagon to get a better view, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. "It's a wagon train," he called down to Sarah, his voice filled with relief. "Maybe 20 wagons. They'll be here by evening." Sarah felt tears of gratitude spring to her eyes. They were saved. This nightmare of abandonment would be over, and they could continue their journey to Oregon Territory with people who would treat them with basic human decency. But as the train drew closer, Sarah's relief began to turn to anxiety. These wagons looked different from the ones in Captain Morrison's train. They were smaller, more makeshift, and the people walking beside them looked rough and desperate. This wasn't a family train of hopeful settlers. This was something else entirely. The wagon master was a hard-faced man named Burke, who looked at Sarah's condition with undisguised disgust. "You folks been left behind?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Thomas explained their situation, trying to maintain his dignity while essentially begging for help. Burke listened with growing impatience, occasionally spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Can't take you," he said finally. "We're traveling fast and light, can't be slowed down by a woman about to drop a baby." "I'm not due for months," Sarah protested, but Burke just laughed harshly. "Lady, I got 6 kids of my own. I know what a woman looks like when she's about ready. You got maybe a few weeks left and we'll be deep in Indian country by then. Sorry, but we can't help you." Thomas tried offering money, then labor, then his blacksmithing skills, but Burke was immovable. His train was made up of men seeking quick fortunes in the goldfields of California, not families building new lives in Oregon. They had no use for a blacksmith and no patience for a pregnant woman. As quickly as hope had appeared on the horizon, it vanished again into the west, leaving them alone with the growing realization that their situation was far more desperate than they had imagined. That night, as Sarah lay in their wagon, listening to coyotes howling in the distance, she placed her hands on her belly and whispered to her unborn child, "We're going to be all right, little one. Your papa and I won't let anything happen to you." But even as she said the words, she could feel the vast emptiness of the prairie pressing in around them, and she began to understand that survival would require more than just hope and determination. It would require a miracle. The journey to the Shawnee village took 4 days instead of 3, but Running Wolf showed no impatience with their slow pace. He walked alongside their wagon, sometimes ranging ahead to scout the trail, sometimes falling back to help when the wheels stuck in soft ground. Sarah marveled at how he seemed to know every stream, every grove of trees, every rise in the land that might offer easier passage. Thomas had been tense and watchful during the first day of travel, his hand never far from his rifle. But gradually, Running Wolf's quiet competence and obvious concern for Sarah's comfort began to ease his suspicions. When the Shawnee hunter shared his own food with them at their noon rest, and when he took care to find a sheltered spot for their evening camp, Thomas began to accept that they might actually have found a friend in this vast wilderness. On the second day, Sarah experienced another bout of false labor that left her frightened and exhausted. Running Wolf immediately called a halt to their travel, helping to make her comfortable in the shade of their wagon while Thomas paced anxiously nearby. The Shawnee hunter disappeared for an hour and returned with a handful of plants and roots that he brewed into a tea. "Drink," he told Sarah gently. "Help with pain. Help baby stay quiet until proper time." Sarah hesitated, looking to Thomas for guidance. They knew nothing about Indian medicines. What if the tea was harmful to her or the baby? Running Wolf seemed to understand her fear. "My mother, she was medicine woman. Teach me about plants that help women with babies. This tea we give to our own women is safe." Something in his voice convinced her. She drank the bitter tea and found that within an hour the pains had eased and she felt stronger than she had in days. Thomas looked amazed at the improvement, and Sarah saw a new respect for Running Wolf growing in her husband's eyes. "How did you know what plants to look for?" Thomas asked as they resumed their journey. All Shawnee children learn plants, Running Wolf explained. Know which ones heal, which ones hurt, which one's good to eat. White people, they not learn this? Thomas shook his head. We learn different things. How to work with iron and wood, how to grow crops, how to read and write. Maybe we teach each other, Running Wolf suggested. You teach ironwork, I teach plant medicine. It was a simple exchange, but Sarah recognized it as something profound. Here were two men from vastly different worlds, beginning to see past their differences to the knowledge they could share. On the third day, they began to see signs of the Shawnee village long before they reached it, smoke rising from cooking fires. Children's voices carried on the wind, the sound of dogs barking and horses nickering. Running Wolf had sent word ahead somehow, because as they crested a low hill, Sarah could see a group of people waiting to welcome them. The village was not what she had expected. Instead of the primitive teepees she had imagined, she saw well-built log houses and bark-covered lodges arranged around a central area. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash stretched along the riverbank, and she could see horses grazing in meadows beyond the village. This was clearly a settled community, not a temporary camp of wandering warriors. But it was the people who surprised her most. As their wagon rolled into the village, Sarah saw faces that ranged from curious to welcoming. Children ran alongside their wagon, chattering in Shawnee and pointing at her with the innocent interest of the young. Women emerged from their houses to watch their arrival, and Sarah was struck by how normal they looked. They wore a mixture of traditional Indian clothing and items that had clearly been traded from white settlements. Many of them smiled at her, and some called out greetings in broken English. Running Wolf led them to a lodge near the center of the village and helped Thomas unhitch their oxen. As Sarah climbed carefully down from the wagon, she was approached by an elderly woman whose bearing suggested authority and whose eyes held both wisdom and kindness. This is my grandmother, Running Wolf said. She is called Wise Woman Who Helps. She speaks some English. The elderly woman studied Sarah with eyes that seemed to see everything. She walked slowly around her, taking in her condition, her weariness, her obvious apprehension. When she spoke, her English was heavily accented but clear. You are far from your own people, white woman. You carry life within you, but also much fear. Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling tears threaten. Yes, ma'am. We were left behind by our wagon train. Your grandson has been very kind to us. Wise Woman Who Helps reached out and gently touched Sarah's belly. The baby immediately kicked at the contact, and the old woman's face broke into a smile. Strong baby. Healthy. Will come when leaves change color, I think. October, Sarah agreed. Maybe November. Good. Time to prepare. Time to make ready safe place for birthing. The old woman turned to address the growing crowd of villagers in rapid Shawnee, then looked back at Sarah. You will stay in my lodge. I have helped many babies come into world. Your baby will be born safe. Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong it made her knees weak. Here, finally, was someone who understood what she needed. Who wasn't afraid of her pregnancy, but saw it as something to be celebrated and protected. Thomas was looking overwhelmed by the attention they were receiving. Several men had approached him, and Running Wolf was apparently explaining their situation and Thomas's skills as a blacksmith. One man, who appeared to be the village chief based on the deference others showed him, stepped forward to address Thomas directly. I am Black Hawk, he said in careful English. War chief of this band. Running Wolf tell us you are skilled with iron. Thomas nodded. Yes, sir. I'm a blacksmith. I can make tools, horseshoes, weapons, whatever you need. Black Hawk gestured toward the edge of the village, where Sarah could now see a crude forge set up under a bark shelter. We trade with French trappers, get iron, but no one here know how to work it proper. You teach us, we give you food, shelter, protection. It was a fair arrangement, more than fair considering their desperate circumstances. Thomas looked at Sarah, who was already being led toward Wise Woman Who Helps lodge by a group of interested women. She caught his eye and nodded encouragingly. I accept your offer, Thomas told Black Hawk. I'll work hard and teach anyone who wants to learn. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of new experiences and challenges. Sarah found herself living in the lodge of Wise Woman Who Helps, surrounded by women who treated her pregnancy as a normal and wonderful occurrence, rather than a burden to be endured. They taught her exercises to strengthen her body for birth, shared foods that would nourish both her and the baby, and most importantly, made her feel safe and valued. The language barrier was challenging at first, but Sarah discovered that kindness and concern needed few words to communicate. When she was tired, someone would bring her a comfortable place to rest. When she was thirsty, Cool water appeared. When she felt lonely for Thomas, who was spending long days at the forge, women would sit with her and share stories she couldn't understand but somehow found comforting anyway. Thomas was thriving in ways that surprised them both. The Shawnee were eager to learn metalworking, and he found himself teaching not just techniques, but sharing the scientific principles behind working with iron and steel. In return, the village men taught him hunting techniques, showed him how to read weather patterns and track animals, and shared knowledge of the wilderness that no white man could have given him. One evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival, Thomas returned to the lodge with excitement written all over his face. "Sarah, you won't believe what happened today," he said, settling beside her on the comfortable furs that served as their bed. "Black Hawk asked me to make a special knife for a ceremony next week. When I asked what kind of ceremony, he said it was to welcome us officially into the tribe." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Welcome us into the tribe? What does that mean?" "I'm not entirely sure, but Running Wolf tried to explain it to me. Apparently, they don't just let anyone stay in the village long term. There has to be some kind of formal acceptance, some ceremony that makes us part of the community instead of just visitors." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. To be accepted into the Shawnee tribe would mean safety and belonging for her and their child, but it would also mean leaving behind everything they had known about themselves and their place in the world. "Are you comfortable with that?" Sarah asked carefully. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Sarah, these people have shown us more kindness and acceptance in 2 weeks than our own wagon train showed us in 3 months of traveling together. They don't see your pregnancy as a burden or a danger. They see it as something to celebrate and protect. If being part of their community means our child will be safe and valued, then yes, I'm comfortable with it." That night, as Sarah lay beside Thomas in the warm lodge, listening to the peaceful sounds of the village settling down for sleep, she placed her hands on her belly and whispered to her unborn child, "Little one, you're going to be born into a world I never could have imagined. Your first lullabies will be sung in Shawnee, and your first solid food will probably be corn mush made by wise woman who helps. But you'll be safe and you'll be loved, and maybe that's more important than I ever understood before." The baby kicked in response, and Sarah chose to interpret it as agreement. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony that would formally make them part of this Shawnee community. In a few months, her child would be born among people who valued life and protected the vulnerable. It wasn't the future she and Thomas had planned when they set out for Oregon territory, but it was beginning to feel like the future they were meant to have. Outside the lodge, she could hear Running Wolf's voice as he sat with the other young men around the evening fire, telling stories and laughing in the darkness. The man who had saved their lives was becoming something more than just their rescuer. He was becoming their friend, their guide into a new way of living. And Sarah suspected that her child would grow up calling him Uncle in the Shawnee way. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah reflected on the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, she had been a respectable blacksmith's wife in Ohio, worried about whether her new dress was fashionable enough for church on Sunday. Now she was about to become a member of a Shawnee tribe, carrying a child who would grow up between two worlds, learning the wisdom of both. It wasn't the life she had planned, but as she fell asleep surrounded by the warmth and acceptance of her new community, Sarah began to think it might be an even better life than she had dared to dream. The ceremony that formally welcomed Sarah and Thomas into the Shawnee tribe took place on a crisp September evening when the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and red. Sarah, now visibly heavy with child, sat in a place of honor beside Wise Woman Who Helps, as the entire village gathered around the central fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on faces she had come to know and love over the past 2 months. Black Hawk stood before the assembly, wearing his finest ceremonial clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and eagle feathers. In his hands he held the knife that Thomas had crafted for this occasion, its blade gleaming in the firelight, its handle wrapped with leather and adorned with symbols that had been carefully explained to both Sarah and Thomas. "Today we welcome 2 souls who came to us lost and afraid," Black Hawk announced in Shawnee, his words then repeated in English by Running Wolf for their benefit. "They were cast out by their own people, left to die in the big grass. But the spirits guided them to us, and we have found them to be good people with valuable gifts to share." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. The formal words couldn't capture the journey that had brought them here, the transformation from desperation to belonging that had taken place in such a short time. Thomas rose when called forward, looking handsome and dignified in the Shawnee clothing the women had made for him. The shirt was beautifully decorated with porcupine quill work, and his hair had been braided with feathers in the Shawnee style. He looked like a different man from the desperate husband who had been abandoned beside a drying stream just 2 months ago. "Do you, Thomas Mitchell, Accept the responsibilities of brotherhood with the Shawnee people. Black Hawk asked through Running Wolf's translation. Will you share our struggles, defend our children, and honor our ways? I do, Thomas replied, his voice strong and clear. Black Hawk made a small cut on Thomas's palm with a ceremonial knife, then cut his own palm and pressed them together, letting their blood mingle. Then you are no longer just Thomas Mitchell. You are Iron Worker who came from far away, and you are our brother. When it was Sarah's turn, Wise Woman Who helped her stand and spoke the ancient words of welcome in the Shawnee language. Even without translation, Sarah could feel the power and solemnity of the moment. Do you, Sarah Mitchell, accept the protection and sisterhood of the Shawnee women? The old woman asked in her careful English. Will you teach our children, share your knowledge, and raise your own child to honor both the white and the Shawnee ways? I do, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Wise Woman Who gently touched Sarah's forehead, then her heart, then her belly where the baby grew. Then you are Mother, who found her true home, and your child will be born into the circle of our protection. As the ceremony concluded with singing and feasting, Sarah found herself surrounded by people congratulating her in both Shawnee and broken English. Children who had initially been shy around her now clustered close, eager to feel the baby kick. Young mothers shared advice and old women shared wisdom. She had never felt so truly welcomed anywhere in her life. The weeks that followed the ceremony passed in a comfortable rhythm of daily life in the village. Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally under the watchful care of Wise Woman who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of exactly what her body needed at each stage. Thomas had settled into his role as the village metalworker with enthusiasm, not only making tools and weapons but teaching several young men the basics of blacksmithing. Running Wolf had become their closest friend and unofficial translator, helping them navigate the subtle social customs of Shawnee life. He spent his evenings teaching Sarah basic Shawnee words so she could communicate better with the other women, and he worked alongside Thomas at the forge, learning metalworking techniques with the quick intelligence that had first impressed them. One afternoon in early October, as Sarah sat outside the lodge sewing tiny clothes for the baby, Running Wolf approached with a serious expression on his face. Mother who found her true home, he said, using her ceremonial name with the gentle teasing that had become his way. I must tell you something that may bring you both joy and sadness. Sarah looked up from her needlework, immediately alert to the gravity in his tone. What is it, Running Wolf? Scouts came back from the Great Trail today. They bring word of White Wagon train, maybe 5 days behind us on the trail to Oregon land. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. A wagon train, still traveling this late in the season. Did they say which train? Did they describe the people? Running Wolf shook his head. Only that it is large train, maybe 40 wagons, moving fast to beat the snow and mountains. Thomas appeared from the direction of the forge, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He had obviously seen them talking and sensed the seriousness of the conversation. What's happening? He asked. Sarah explained what Running Wolf had told her, watching her husband's face carefully. She saw a flicker of something there. Longing, perhaps, or regret. They had built a good life here with the Shawnee, but it wasn't the life they had originally planned. Do you think it might be people we know? Thomas asked carefully. Maybe, Running Wolf said. Or maybe just other white families seeking Oregon land like you planned. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Did they want to make contact with this wagon train? Did they want to continue to Oregon territory? Or had they truly found their home among the Shawnee? That evening, Sarah and Thomas walked to the edge of the village to talk privately about this unexpected development. The baby was very active now, responding to her emotional state, and Sarah found herself unconsciously rubbing her belly as they discussed their options. We could go to them, Thomas said quietly. With the baby due any day now, we might be able to join them and continue to Oregon. Start the life we originally planned. Is that what you want? Sarah asked. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening prairie. I don't know, Sarah. 2 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Oregon territory was our dream, our plan for the future. But now we have a different life, Sarah finished. A good life. Better than good. These people accepted us when our own kind rejected us. They've made us part of their family. Running Wolf risked his own safety to save us. Wise Woman Who treats you like her own daughter. The children here will grow up calling our baby brother or sister. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of his words deep in her bones. But we're still white, Thomas. Our child will be half white, half Shawnee in their mind, but all white in the eyes of the world outside this village. Does that matter? Sarah considered the question seriously. It might someday. When our child is older and has to choose between two worlds, it might be easier if we gave them access to both. They talked long into the night, weighing their options. Stay with the Shawnee, where they were safe and valued, where their child would be born into a loving community, or risk everything to join the wagon train and continue to Oregon territory, where they would be strangers again, but where their child would grow up in the white world they had been born into. The decision was made for them 3 days later when Sarah went into labor, 2 weeks earlier than expected. She woke before dawn with strong, regular contractions that told her immediately this was not false labor. The baby was coming, and there would be no joining any wagon train until after their child was safely born. Wise woman who helps took charge with the calm efficiency of someone who had guided dozens of babies into the world. She sent Thomas away to wait with the men, as was the Shawnee custom, and surrounded Sarah with experienced women who knew exactly what to do. The labor was long and difficult, but Sarah never felt afraid. The Shawnee women sang traditional birthing songs, massaged her back when the pain was strongest, and gave her herbal teas that seemed to ease her discomfort. When the final stage of labor arrived, and Sarah felt as if she couldn't endure another moment, Wise Woman Who Helps took her hands and looked into her eyes. "Your baby chooses to be born Shawnee," the old woman said firmly. "Born into our protection, under our care. This is good sign. Baby will be bridge between two peoples." At sunset on October 15, 1847, Sarah gave birth to a healthy daughter with a powerful voice and strong lungs. As Wise Woman Who Helps place the baby in her arms, Sarah looked down into the most beautiful face she had ever seen and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. Thomas was brought in to meet his daughter as the women cleaned up around them. His eyes filled with tears as he gently touched the baby's tiny hand, and Sarah saw in his face the same overwhelming love she felt. "She's perfect," he whispered. "What should we call her?" Sarah looked around at the women who had helped bring her daughter safely into the world, at Wise Woman Who Helps, whose skills had probably saved both their lives, at the warm lodge where they had found sanctuary when their own people had abandoned them. "Hope," she said firmly. "Her name is Hope, Hope Mitchell, and her Shawnee name will be Bridge to Between Peoples." As if she understood and approved, Baby Hope opened her eyes for the first time and looked directly at her mother with the alert, intelligent gaze of someone ready to take on the world. 3 weeks later, when Sarah had recovered her strength and Hope was thriving, Running Wolf came to them with news that the wagon train had passed by, heading west toward the mountains. They had missed their chance to rejoin the white world, if it had ever really been a chance at all. But as Sarah sat in the warm lodge, nursing her daughter while Thomas worked at the forge, and the sounds of the Shawnee village surrounded them with life and community, she realized she felt no regret at all. They had found something more precious than the Oregon territory they had originally sought. They had found home. Hope would grow up bilingual, learning both English and Shawnee. She would know how to work iron like her father and use healing plants like her Shawnee grandmother. She would be a bridge between two worlds, belonging fully to both, rejected by neither. And perhaps most importantly, she would never know what it felt like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect her. She would grow up surrounded by love, valued for who she was, safe in the knowledge that her community would never cast her out no matter what challenges life might bring. As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, Hope nursing peacefully at her breast, and Thomas breathing steadily beside her, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. They had set out seeking the promised land of Oregon territory, but they had found something far more valuable. They had found a people who understood that true civilization wasn't measured in cities and farms and roads, but in the willingness to care for strangers, to protect the vulnerable, and to share what you had with those in need. Hope stirred in her arms and made a soft sound, and Sarah smiled in the darkness. Her daughter would grow up knowing both worlds, but she would never doubt which one had opened its arms to welcome her family when they needed refuge most. Outside the lodge, the night sounds of the Shawnee village settled around them like a lullaby. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself sink into the peace of knowing that tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, her family would be safe, valued, and loved. They had found their true home at last, in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected people. And baby Hope, bridge between peoples, slept peacefully in her mother's arms, surrounded by the warmth and protection of a community that had chosen to see strangers not as threats to be feared, but as gifts to be treasured.